And welcome back to Windows Phone Jumpstart. This session that we're covering now is we're going to talk about lists and list items and how we work with them in Windows Phone in the Windows Phone XAML framework. So, in this module, we're going to cover list controls. Which different controls can we use to manage big lists of objects and items, and what the capabilities those controls have. We're going to go through how do we create these list items, not just creating how we display our data, but also what capabilities, how we change and alter the visual style of those capabilities. Then we're going to dig in deep, look at grouped lists and grouping navigation, often called a jump list. And then last, we're going to cover really long lists. We're talking hundreds, maybe thousands of objects. And how do we deal with that? How do we get the best performance possible out of our lists? So first, let's start looking at some list controls. What do we have available for us in Windows Phone XAML? And this is actually, almost everything you're going to see here is Windows Phone XAML, Windows Phone as well as Windows. And I'll try to make some call-outs when we deal with things that are a little bit different on the Windows and Windows Phone sides. But for the most part, everything you're looking here is going to be pretty universal. So the first kind of control we have is a list view, and this is going to be just straight up and down lists of objects. Grid view is going to be, it's going to render to the side and then wrap around. We'll look at a little bit of that. There still is a list box. If you are a Silverlight developer or you're an WPF developer and you've used a list box since nigh on 6 years, it's still there, but it doesn't have all the capabilities that we have with list view and grid view. I would consider it more.
I discovered it's also not theme aware. So
it's not theme aware. It is a last resort. If it's something that maybe you've got some legacy code and you just don't want to rip out all of your templates, you don't want to go through all of that work again, you can use your list box. It's still there. So the list view, as I said, it's a vertical list of items. It's good for these simple lists as well as for group lists, and the layout format is simply top to bottom, one on top of another. The grid view is a grid of items, and we're looking usually at image-based items here. So if you've got something, you've got a nice square image that you want to display for it, you can put the image in there with a smaller amount of text, and this is going to render from left to right, and then down to another row, left to right, down to another row.
This is a nice one for adapting to bigger screen display and sizes and
yep.
stuff.
Yeah. This one works particularly well with Windows over Windows Phone. But both of these controls are built kind of the same way. There's a giant pile of templates that you can use to style your control to make it act a certain, all the ways we want it to act. And I'm going to go through those controls really quickly here. Or those different templates really quickly here. First, we have header and footer templates. And the header and footer templates are just simple top of my list, bottom of my list sorts of templates. They're very simple. There's not a lot of interaction you can do with those. We've got the item template, and the item template is what's the data of the object that I'm showing. That's where I define which data am I going to show and what's it going to look like. We have the item container style for our list control, and that has nothing to do with the data inside the item. Instead, it is dealing with the style, the state that the data is in. So there can be many different states. We'll talk about that in a little more depth in a moment. The items panel, which defines how our items are going to be laid out inside list control. And then if we're grouping our items, we have a group style, which has a group container style and a group header template. And that's going to define the style of what do the headers of our different groups look like when they're rendered. So starting with our headers and footers,
it's probably worth saying that. I mean, it sounds kind of scary, all these templates, but
right.
In many cases, you only need one of them, which is the item template, the data template.
Yeah. For the most part, most of the work that we're doing is happening in the item template. That's where we say, my object looks like this. I want these data properties to show up, and that's pretty much all you want to do. but the list view and grid view are enormously extensible controls, and there's just an they're enormously powerful, and there's a lot of stuff we can do with it. So the header template always displays at the top of your list. The footer template always at the bottom of the list. It seems kind of obvious. The styles that you see in here are not our recommended styles. That sort of faded color. But the reason it looks like that is because I wanted to show that these are completely stylable. And so you don't have to simply have a piece of text with a standard color at the top or the bottom with your header or your footer. You could, let's say you're loading 50 objects at a time. And when the user gets to the bottom of those objects, they want to load more. Well, you could make your footer a button. It could just be a button, and when you tap the button, it loads a bunch more items. Or maybe it points to an app bar item that allows you to load that. So this it doesn't have to be very standard. It's fully stylable, fully templatable. The item template is where we live most of our lives. Here you see a list view item template as well as a grid view item template, and it just simply displays the item data. The images that we see here are images that are associated with the object. They've been rendered on the left-hand side for the list view item template, and then they take up the bulk of the template with the grid view. List items also have an item container style. And this defines how the item is going to look when it's in a different state. These states could be multiple selection mode or the reorder mode. You can see that we've changed the opacity a little bit. It looks different when it's selected versus unselected. And it even supports different styles for data virtualization of the item. The item container style is a powerful element, and it does a lot of things. But you can just leave it alone, and you'll get all the default styles that your list item should look like according to the Windows Phone designers. Very sharp group of people. The items panel, generally speaking, you're just going to want to leave this one alone, but for the sake of comprehensive information. It manages the item-by-item layout. So with the list view, you have an item stack panel with the orientation vertical. With the grid view, you have an items wrap panel with an orientation vertical or horizontal. And yeah, you can go in and change these. You're going to lose a lot of the virtualization that's built into the controls. So my recommendation, leave this one alone. Okay, so that's an overview of the templates that we have available. Let's look a little bit at the capabilities that these list controls give us. We can do some really cool stuff like reordering. And when we shift our list view or grid view into a reordering mode, our items shift into this floating UI. We can reorder very simply by just tapping on an item and then dragging it up or down the list. Or with a grid view, it would be across our list. There's a little bit of a difference between Windows and Windows Phone here. To switch into reorder mode with Windows Phone, we change the reorder mode property on our list view to be list view reorder mode .enabled. Whereas with Windows, we change the property can reorder items from true to false or false to true, and that'll change the whether or not we're actively reordering the list. One note here, group lists cannot be reordered, so only a straight list of objects is going to be able to be reordered in a list view or in a grid view. We have support for multi-selection, and multi-selection just displays checkboxes for multi-selection and then hides the checkboxes for single selection. You get some really great styles depending on whether you're in list view or grid view. But the other thing that this gives you is when you switch between one or the other, you get a cool little animation where the checkbox comes in, slides in from the side, slides out from the side. Changing that is very simple. Just change the selection mode on your list view or grid view to list view selection mode .multiple. So let's look at the demo for creating. We're going to look at creating a list item template, and we'll jump a little bit into working with our item container style. But not too much because it's really complex. Okay, so here is, I'm just going to go ahead and run this application, Windows Phone. And when you get to this sample, you will be able to look at how this, see how this looks. This is a universal project. All the stuff that I'm showing you is stuff that works across Windows and Windows Phone. So go ahead and run this. Pull it up, here it comes. We're going to take a look at our list view. Now this is just a list view with a binding. We have no list templates in here. We're simply bound to...
So what we're seeing there is, well, that's just the type of the... It dumps the type of the object out.
Exactly, exactly. With no item template in place, it basically calls the toString method of whatever object you have, and it dumps that string as a text inside of here. That's actually good information to know, because you could override the toString method in your object and give a better, really simple way of dealing with that. So let's stop that, and let's go ahead and we're going to open up our document outline. Oh. There we go. Open up our document outline. We're going to right-click on our sample list view. We're going to edit additional templates. Edit the item template. So you see all the templates that I've been talking about. Yeah. They're actually right there. We can kind of discover it just by right-clicking and walking through this. I already have a template. We're not going to build a whole new template, so we'll just take a look at our sample data template. And then we can go and edit that if we want here. I'm just going to edit that to pull up the data template. We can take a look. It's just a simple grid. We've got an image in there. The image has a binding. We've got a couple of text blocks, one for our title, one for our subtitle. So with that in place...
So what you're saying is every item in this list that's going to be displayed will be laid out in a little grid of its own, using its own text block and another text block.
Yep. And so,
and the image, yeah.
And that's what we get. There's we have our image, we have a simple binding for the text, for the title, for the subtitle, and now we have a list view that looks great.
Yep.
And has gotten started. We can tap on these buttons down here, and this is the mode that I was showing earlier. This is multiple select mode. We can select, make it go away, turn it on. But let's say we wanted to change the color of that checkbox, picking something really simple so that we can do it quickly.
So this is about customizing one of the built-in templates.
Right. So we're changing the not the items themselves, but how the items are being displayed when they're in a particular mode.
All right.
So this is actually most easily done inside of Blend, and I'll show why in a minute.
So we haven't mentioned Blend. We probably ought to say that when you get the SDK, you actually get two fully fledged developer tools. Yeah.
Right. So
Visual Studio that we've been using up to now, and then Blend, which is kind of
Visual Studio Blend, and it's considered a kind of a designer tool.
Yeah.
It's got some really powerful features, and one of those features is the ability to visually edit the Visual State Manager. And the item container style relies very heavily on the Visual State Manager to pick to show which designs we want to show in any given state. And so we're going to say this is our list view item container style, and this is going to pull a copy of that item container style out of our generic.xaml we showed earlier and just kind of dump it into our local resources. Now what we see here is, here's our states tab, and these are all the visual states that a list view item can support. We have normal, press, disabled, pointer over. We have focus states, drag states, selection hint states. There's a lot of different. There's a lot of power in our list view.
It's kind of when you said how you get that nice animation as when you turn the multi-select on and off. Well, hey, that doesn't come for free.
Yeah. So it's
designed somewhere.
It's a really powerful control. But what we're going to look at is our list view multiple select. You see how it pulls up the state that we go into when we're in a list view multiple select. And we can just walk through the visual tree here. And here's the rectangle that I was talking about. And we're just going to do something really silly. We're just going to change some of the colors. We're going to change the stroke color to blue. And that's all we're going to do. We don't need to change anything else about the state. We just need to change one property with the list multi-select selected inside of our Visual State Manager. We save that, and if we go and reload it. You can see that we have that state now for our checkbox. And so you can do a lot with this. You can completely rebuild the entire list box if you want. The entire list box item container style. But I just wanted to show the easiest way to go in that and maybe do a little bit of exploring is to jump into Blend and use that Visual State Manager to do that. So we're going to jump back to our presentation. And now we're going to talk a little bit about grouped lists. Lists are great, but grouped lists are better. If you have a really big data set and you want to group it according to a particular property, grouped lists are a great way of doing that. Grouping data requires a little bit of a change to our data source. Before we were simply binding to an observable collection or maybe a list of data, but if we're going to be grouping our data, we actually need to bind it to a collection view source. We technically can bind it to a list of lists. If you do this, you won't get a jump list. There will be no way of navigating through that, and it'll be very confusing for the user, so don't.
So collection view source is this fancy list of lists
which
enables all this extra behavior.
Which I'm going to show in just a minute.
Right.
In addition, if you want the jump lists, and you do, then there are two kinds of jump lists. There's a keyed list, which is what you see over at the side, over on the right-hand side, where we see a pile of businesses: Fabricam, Contoso, Fourth Coffee, Graphic Design, and they're aligned in a list. The other kind of jump list we can have is an alpha key group, and that's an alphabetic group where we've arranged all of our items alphabetically, and we can just we can navigate through them from A to Z, much like we would in the context portion of the native application, the native contacts application. With the key list, we would start with a list of data, and we'd use a keyed list class. Now, a keyed list class is something that we have inside of the demo. It's also kind of out there in the wild because it was used to build grouped lists in Windows Phone 8. So if you look up a keyed list and the long list selector, which was the proper control in Windows Phone 8, you'll be able to find this out there. We take our single list and we format that using the following link query, and we'll walk through that here. Our items is the variable for our simple list of items. Okay, so we're going to select that list of items. We're going to order it by some property that we want to sort by. Then we're going to group it by that property. And finally, we're going to select a keyed list of our objects from the result of that order and group. Then lastly, we can dump that into a list or observable collection of keyed lists. And so every single one of these items, Fourth Coffee, is actually a keyed list of sampled items. The Margie's Travel is a keyed list of sampled items. So what we're actually binding to is a list of keyed lists of sample items.
The headache in all this is just getting your data structured.
Right.
Once you got it right, you just throw it at the control. And
Exactly. Once it's a little bit of work to get this put together. Once it's put together, you get a really beautiful user interaction and a really powerful control. The alpha key group is, again, we'll start with our list of data. We create that alpha key group class. And the alpha key group class is more complex than the keyed list, but it is much easier to work with because our grouping is simply, we call this method alpha key group with the kind of item we're using, sample item, dot create groups, and we give it our list of items, and we give it the property we want to sort on, and we give it, and then we say, yes, we want to order their items, order these items, and it will hand back exactly the sort of list that we can bind to.
Yeah. Okay, it does all the work for you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then last little piece of this is that collection view source, where once we've set a data context on our page where we can see that object, we can place the collection view source in our resources, and we set the source to the property, the object we want to bind to, and the source equals binding. And then inside of our list view, we bind to that static resource that we had created. In our collection view source, if we've used a keyed list or we've used an alpha key group, the items path is always internal list. The is source group is always true. So that's the data structure that we need in order to do grouping. Now, the grouping style and templates. Previously, we had a jump list style in Windows Phone 8. That is changed so that now we're using this group style. If you're a Windows 8 developer, you're familiar with this already. We can take the group style. Hide if empty is true. You see an example of that is in the far left-hand object here. We have nothing that starts with the letter B. And so we don't want to show the B group because it's empty. And so that's what hides if empty set to true does. Then we have our group style header template, and you can kind of do anything you want. Generally, it's just a box for alphabetic and a line for your keyed list. The real important part is you need a text block in there that binds to the key, because that is the thing that you have grouped by.
So if you don't do that, you won't see the key.
Exactly, exactly. And so then we have a semantic zoom control, and this is how we do our group list navigation. We have a semantic group zoom control. If you're familiar with from the Windows Phone 8 or from Windows 8, you could do this sort of pinch zoom, and you would go into a zoomed out view. You could go into a zoomed in view. Well, with Windows Phone, we're not using that. We don't use that pinch zoom. But we still have a zoomed in view and a zoomed out view, and it's designed specifically for this list view and grid view control navigation. Inside the zoomed in view, we've got our list view or grid view, and the item source binds to that collection view source just like we've seen. In the zoomed out view, it's a list view or a grid view, and the items source is bound to the same collection view source, but with a path to the collection groups. The zoomed in view is whatever default view, whatever outline or however we've placed that semantic zoom. So in this case, you see here, it's probably in a grid. It's in a grid, and it respects all the margins, and it respects all the boundaries, and it respects all the grid rows and columns that it's been placed in. But the zoomed out view is triggered by that group interaction, and it always overlays the entire screen as a flyout. Has a transparent background, so one thing you might want to do is make it a semi-transparent background to try to cut out some of that visual noise.
So what you're saying is when you tap on one of the grids, you're going to show us now. Yeah,
yeah, right.
When you tap on one of the groups,
right,
then it zooms out. You get the zoomed out view where you can select all the different from the wider group collection of groups.
Yep, yep. And so I'm going to, as quickly as possible, walk through the creation. So here we have our group grid view, and you can see right now we don't have the semantic zoom hooked up. So we have that interaction. It looks like it should be doing something when I tap on the A, when I tap on the C.
So this is like all we're seeing here is the zoomed in view, the default view.
Right. This is a default. This is just a grid view with no semantic zoom in place.
Yeah.
So let's go over to jump over to my, I should have, that's apparently not going to do that. Let's take a quick look at our collection view source. And this is what we were seeing, where we have the sources grouped, we have the items path to the internal path, and the source is to an alpha grouped property that we have in our view model. And now I'm going to have to scroll down to the sample. Okay, so here's the grid view that we were looking at. We have our item source, we have our items template, and the header template. I said before, the key part of this is that we have a text block that's bound to the key. Now we have some semantic zoom elements commented, and we're just going to uncomment there. So now we have our semantic zoom, and the grid view that we had before is inside the zoomed in view.
Okay.
Inside the zoomed out view is another grid view. The item source is the same as the item source for our first grid view with this path equals collection groups, path equals collection groups at the end of it. And that's important. It's important that our grid views or our list views in the zoomed in view and zoomed out view are bound to the same thing, because otherwise the semantic view won't know what to do when it zooms in or in and out. And you can see instead of, you can see that in the item template, we are binding to, the text is bound to the binding group.key. And so with all of those bindings and with all of those grid views in place, if we run the application, and we go to our group grid view. Now, if we tap on A, you see that we've got the ability to quickly navigate between our many different items using that alphanumeric navigation. So that's a whirlwind overview of lists and the different templates that we can do and how to do the grouping and how to do our jump list navigation. Let's touch real quickly on some of our list best practices. When we do item rendering group visualization, our group layouts are virtualized. And so the control already knows how big each group needs to be, even if it hasn't rendered all the items inside of that group. The list control renders elements not necessarily in the viewport, but near the viewport. And so there's a certain buffer above and below the items that we can see where those items have also been rendered in anticipation of the user scrolling down to them, so scrolling down or up to them. But if we have a really long list, then we're going to want to do something called progressive item rendering. And this means that maybe if we're scrolling really, really fast, the items that we have, they don't have enough time to render in. And that's if we're using something called unphased rendering, where basically it's all or nothing. Either none of your item is visible, or the entire item is visible, every data element inside of it, every image. A great way to try to speed up our list and try to help the user is by implementing a phased rendering. And with a phased rendering, we can say, first thing that we want is a placeholder color just in place. Very simple, a simple square, something that's easy to render and very fast. Then we want the most important textual information for our item. Then maybe the second most important, and then finally, because the images take the longest to pull up and longest to render, do those last. And that way, we give the user something that they can see, they can hold on to, they can get ready as the image is coming in.
So this is while it's whizzing past your eyes very fast, because you're you're swiping like a crazy thing.
Right, exactly.
So you'll see a blue blur go past, but
right, you'll see a blue blur, and then if you're pulling, especially if you're using very high resolution images, and this is something that's important for phone because we're dealing with small, lower resources. But if we have really big images and we're working on a Windows application, then when we're scrolling across, it could take a while to pull all of those images up, and so this phased rendering gives the user a lot better experience. So how do we do that? We can do it with this thing called container content changing, and this fires whenever the item is realized. Whenever the system looks at any individual's item and says, "Whoa, I need to render that item." The item can then be rendered in phases. Here's the event handler. You see, we set the args.handled equals true, and the first phase we come to is going to be phase 0. We will always come to phase 0 first. And then we can do things like we can show a placeholder shape and then register an update callback and for the next phase of rendering.
So you just keep registering callbacks
and
wait when you've got more to show. Then
yep,
stop
and you can.
When you've...
Yep, and what this will and what this event handler does is it goes in, it renders the first thing. It says, "Do I have any more resources available? If I do, it'll go to the next callback. If it doesn't, it won't go to the next callback." So it's pretty cool that way. Yeah, and the later phases will be skipped if too much time is needed, as you can see here. So first, we want to show the text. Then we want to show an image. Phase priorities are, as I mentioned before, simple shapes, those placeholder visuals I was talking about. Try to keep those non-opacity, simple colors, blocks, squares, and rectangles. Then the key text, then other text, and then lastly, the images. One tip is that when you're hiding and showing these items inside of your item template, do not use visibility, because when you change the visibility from collapsed to visible, the layout system looks at that and says, oh, wait a second, the whole thing has changed, I need to render everything all over again. Yeah. And so you lose all of the performance benefits you got by using that content container changing event.
But it's quite happy to say, okay, this item's still there, but it's just got a visibility of 0. So
right, yeah. Whenever the opacity is set to, the opacity is set to 0, the renderer looks at that and says, I don't care.
It's still there, but
yep.
Whatever, yeah.
So I'm gonna run through this as quickly as possible because we're coming up on a meal break here. And I'm actually just going to show this, show the code that we have available for this. So if we go down to our, apparently when I don't have the design mode open, it won't let me do this. Okay, so here's the list view that we have that's rendering all the objects that we've been seeing in the previous demos. We can do this content container changing, and you see we already have an incremental update handler in there. We get that, and we go to our list view page, and here is our incremental update. Now the way that we work with this is I have for my own help, this is what my item looks like, along with all of the names.
Handy little diagram.
Right, names of all the items I have in there. The first thing we do is we grab our item container and grab the content template root. That's going to be a grid. And then using that template root, we can find all of the objects that are inside of our item template. So we grab copies of all of those objects, or references to all those objects. We make our placeholder visible, and then we make our item image, our title, and our subtitle invisible.
Right.
And we say we want another callback, and we can show the first piece of text. We go in here, and you see we're in phase 1. So make sure we're in phase 1. And in this case, we're actually going to be grabbing the sample item along with the item container.
So the first one didn't even have any data.
Yeah, the first one, it was nothing but a placeholder visual.
But now we're interested in the data of this object. Yeah.
Yep. So we grab our template root. We grab the object that is our title, and we're actually setting the title manually. And this is because we're interested entirely in performance here. And the data binding, while it is awesome, can slow us down if we're data binding for every single object. And so we're going to use explicitly set the title on that.
You MVVM zealots, you're going to have to put aside your objections at this point.
Right, right.
Performance.
This is all about the performance.
Yeah.
And so we set that text, we set that opacity, and we register another update. And in this case, we're only going to register these 3 different render phases.
And this is the last one, so there's no new callback.
Right, we don't need another callback on this. This is phase 2. We get our item, we get our template root, we get all the objects that we want to change, the image, the text block. In this case, we want the placeholder to go away because everything has been loaded in. So we set all of our data, we set all of our opacity, and I'm going to run this, and it'll take 5 seconds, I hope, to show it. But inside our list view, I'm not sure. I'm not even sure I can run it fast enough to get that performance hit. But it is happening in there. If we set the a breakpoint, you'd see all of the data coming in. Yeah. And so this is for people who really, really need the highest possible performance out of their list views. Is you can implement this phase rendering to make that happen.
Right. Nice.
So. That's it for lists and list items. We covered the controls. We covered the creating list items, the group list, the group navigation, and then some of the high performance best practices that we have available. We're going to take a break now. I've gone a little bit over. We're taking a meal break, but we will return at the top of the next hour.
See you then.
Thank you for joining us.